to those of you guys joining us from the US, and good evening to those of you guys joining us from China. And I know that there are many of you guys joining us from elsewhere around the world. Welcome to everybody. My name is Devin Lau, and I'm the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. Thank you for joining us today for what is proving to be quite the popular topic. Quick word of introduction, because I know that we have so many people on today that maybe not everybody is familiar with Yale Center Beijing. Yale Center Beijing is the first and only university-wide center for Yale University outside of New Haven, of course, established in 2014. And our mission is to continue to highlight and promote all the work that goes on at Yale, especially for our audience in China. But ever since the pandemic, of course, we've expanded our reach to include quite the global audience. And in the past year and a half or so, we've been lucky to have many of these Zoom talks spanning all sectors of Yale, including today's talk, which is a talk on history. But also we have, of course, Professor Zhang Taisu of the law school, but we've also had many activities spanning the sciences and economics and the arts, so on and so forth. And so we're very lucky today to have quite the interesting topic. So Professor Taisu Zhang is a professor of law at Yale Law School, as well as a professor of history. He works on comparative legal and economic history, private law theory, and contemporary Chinese law and politics. He holds 3 degrees from Yale, a BA in history and mathematics, a JD, as well as a PhD in history. And he's also taught at the Duke University School of Law, the University of Hong Kong, Brown University, and the Tsinghua University School of Law. Today's talk is actually part of a planned trilogy of books that he's been working on the institutional and cultural origins of early modern economic divergence. His first book of this trilogy, The Laws and Economics of Confucianism, Kinship and Property in Pre-Industrial China and England, was published by Cambridge University Press and received in 2018 the President's Award from the Social Science History Association, as well as the Gaddis Smith Book Prize from the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. So this is a quite long-ranging and wide-ranging topic that he's looking into, and today's talk is looking into a more specific aspect of that. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Taisu Zhang.
All right, thank you, Devin. And it's nice to be doing something with the YCB for, I think, the first time, actually. Back in the day when I was first admitted to Yale as an undergrad, there was this thing in Beijing called the Yale Beijing Club, which was like this less formal bunch of alumni who did things occasionally together. And we had these like lunches with speakers, sometimes from Yale. Very often, usually it was at the Swiss Hotel, I think in like right outside of Dongsi Shitiao in Chaoyang. Now, of course, YCB is a massive upgrade from that, and it's nice to see Yale having more formal and sophisticated programming in Beijing. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, I can't go back there, but I would love to see you guys when I manage to make it back to Beijing sometime. And thank you to the audience for joining me this morning. This talk is not going to be, like, I was under the impression that the main audience for YCB talks was going to be alumni. Apparently that was a mistaken impression, at least for this one. But nonetheless, this talk is geared not necessarily towards an academic audience. It's kind of like a simplified, hopefully made more interesting summary of some ideas that I've developed in book 2 of the trilogy that Devin just mentioned, which is now complete and in the final process at Cambridge, and hopefully it'll come out perhaps late next year, I think, given their speed. But the book is complete, and I'm happy to talk about some of the ideas. It has a lot of wide-ranging comparative elements, both with other Chinese dynasties and also with other early modern empires. So, although technically this is a book and a talk on a certain facet of Qing dynasty history, I do believe it has implications well beyond that. So let me start the talk, and let's begin by sharing my screen. All right, so the talk is called "Why Was the Late Imperial Chinese State So Weak?" By late imperial, basically I mean Qing. And whoops, yeah. So let's just talk about some of the basic motivation for this project very quickly. So despite being known as a despotic regime, I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with the term Oriental despotism, that supposedly exercised enormous power over its subject. The late Imperial Chinese state was, in fact, especially after something like 1700, a pretty weak one in terms of both administrative, coercive, and fiscal capacity. If you track the broader trends in Chinese state capacity, there was, so if you start out during the Tang, right, the Tang has a certain measure of state capacity, it has a large amount of military capacity, but governance capacity and administrative capacity was not terribly high. Then it went up quite sharply during the Song, which really was the peak of Chinese state capacity prior to 1912. And then from the Song onwards, it was kind of like downhill all the way, right? So you go to the Yuan, the Ming, and to the Qing, and state capacity, at least by measures of coercive power and formal governmental power, it's kind of going down. It's going down all the time. Now, the most direct measure of this, the most perhaps like most intuitive way of measuring this, which is not the only possible way, and it's a slightly controversial topic that we can talk about later on in the Q&A. But the most direct measure is probably fiscal capacity. The state's ability to extract taxes from the population. Now, this declined quite severely over the course of the second millennium. It peaks in across pre-modern, pre-19, let's just say pre-1927 Chinese history. Basically peaks in the Song, reaching at the time probably over 10% of estimated GDP. This was at the time one of the highest levels in the world. Then it comes back down to around 5% in the Ming, which was more or less where it was in the Tang as well. You can kind of think of this as like the common plateau for Chinese dynasties. The Song was abnormally high. But beyond the Ming, the Qing was abnormally low. Right? But by the mid-Qing, by the mid to late Qing, government taxation was basically less than 1% of GDP, at least formal governmental taxation. Now, there are some parts of this narrative that should be flagged right away, right? The Song, saying that it was all the way downhill from the Song, a little bit, it kind of masks the fact that the Song was really unique in Imperial Chinese history. It was, not only was it the high point for state fiscal and administrative capacity, the Song also has some pretty unique features. You compare it to the Tang, the Ming, and the Qing, of course, the Yuan. It's the only major dynasty that wasn't really kind of like a central or kind of like Central East Asian empire. It had clear boundaries. It was relatively constrained in geographical reach, and because it was militarily weaker than its northern and eventually northwestern neighbors, the Liao and even the Xia, the Song was kind of like boxed in terms of boundaries. Whereas in comparison, right, the Tang, the Yuan, the Ming, the Qing, these are all kind of expansionist, somewhat Central Asian empires that have boundaries that are kind of constantly trying to expand. The Qing especially is the subject of this massive academic literature that you guys may know, this new Qing history stuff, which tells the story of how Qing goes into Central Asia, expands into what is now Xinjiang and Tibet, and so on and so forth. Now, the fact the Song was a centralized state with clear boundaries may well be an explanation for why Song fiscal capacity was unusually strong, because it's much easier to have strong fiscal capacity in these kind of like more compact, clearly bounded states. So in some ways, like the Song, you can kind of think of the Song as this abnormal high point, whereas the Tang and Ming were kind of like the norm for Chinese dynastic state capacity. But even within that comparison set, the Qing is unusually weak, right? And this begins to demand further explanation. Now, the Qing also breaks a relatively common pattern, actually a largely universal pattern of amongst major Chinese dynasties, Every other major Chinese dynasty more or less has the following fiscal history. You start off at relatively low levels at the start of the dynasty because you just took over from the previous dynasty after a period of likely significant chaos. You want to show your benevolence, so you lower taxes. At some point, the population recovers, the economy recovers, and you discover that your fiscal income is not enough to meet the administrative demands of an expanding dynasty. So what tends to happen is around mid-dynasty, there is a set of fiscal reforms that tries to expand the tax base and make it simpler and easier to collect taxes. And there is fiscal expansion, at least in absolute terms, not necessarily as a percentage of GDP, but the state does make an effort at least to keep the overall volume of taxation somewhat on par with economic recovery and expansion. The Qing is a major break, perhaps the only significant break to this pattern in Chinese history. Of course, like not only was the Qing, because so the core characteristic of the Qing, as we're going to talk about in a second, is that basically the absolute volume of its fiscal income stagnates from essentially 1720 onwards, all the way towards the end of the dynasty, and especially one core component, the agricultural tax, completely stagnates. This had not been the case in any other previous dynasty. Like in every other major previous dynasty, the agricultural tax, which is the core component of the tax system, always expands somewhat after mid-dynasty, and in most cases, very significantly so. Of course, the Qing is also an extreme outlier in the early modern world. So we've talked about these like vertical comparisons with previous Chinese dynasties. If you look at horizontal comparisons with other early modern states compared to like the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, it was even compared with these other land-based Asian empires. They usually tax at around 4 to 5% of GDP. So more or less on par with what the Ming and Tang did, but the Qing was extremely low. Compared with European states, with the Brits, with the French or the Germans, those were usually 10% or higher. The English were much higher at something like 15%. For most of its early modern history, and compared with, say, Japan, even prior to the major restoration, Japan, the daimyos, the shogunates, combined, they were taxing something like 20% or more of Japanese GDP, bringing it into like official government coffers. So whether you compare this thing horizontally or vertically, it's abnormally weak in terms of fiscal capacity. And this is the thing that this entire book is designed to explain. Now, the core problem with Qing taxation was its inability, or you could perhaps say unwillingness, to increase agricultural taxes, right? So as we'll talk about in a bit more detail, the total volume of the agricultural tax basically stagnates after 1680 and really extremely so after 1720. And again, this is quite unique. Now, of course, during the same period of time, this was not like you could say, okay, you know, tax the total volume of agricultural taxes stagnates. Does that mean that the overall agrarian economy has also stagnated? Of course not, right? So during the same period of time, from 1680 to let's say 1900. The total volume of agricultural production in the Qing triples, but perhaps more than triples. But the amount of tax that the state extracts from this tripling sector remains almost completely the same. So essentially, like per capita tax rates plummet, just completely shrink to the point of virtual non-existence by the 19th century. And of course, even within the Qing fiscal system, the agricultural tax was treated differently than non-agricultural taxes, right? So commercial taxes, taxes on industry, salt taxes, and so on and so forth. Those taxes actually did not stagnate, right? They largely kept up with the pace of economic growth from the 1650s all the way to the 1840s. And after 1850, after the Taiping rebellion throws the Qing into this massive fiscal crisis, all of these non-agricultural taxes increase very rapidly in response to this massive escalation. in fiscal demand, but of course, the sharp contrast is the agricultural tax, the traditional linchpin of the system, continues to stagnate. So by the end of the Qing, the agricultural tax is not even the most important tax in the fiscal structure. That honor goes to the commercial taxes, which is quite shocking because the Qing had not relied so heavily, no Chinese dynasty had relied so heavily on commercial taxation since pretty much the peak of the Song. So if you want to talk about this in somewhat academic jargon, to a large extent, Qing non-agricultural taxation was more or less rational. It responded to fluctuations in demand. It made an effort to keep up with economic and demographic expansion. In contrast, the agricultural tax was essentially completely unresponsive to any of these demand side or supply side changes. And in the end, if you're talking about one primary culprit for Qing fiscal weakness, you have to talk about this extremely unusual stagnation of the agricultural tax. Now, does this mean, like, one possible explanation, one simple explanation that immediately comes to mind for this entire narrative is perhaps that this is because non-agricultural tax hikes, especially after 1850, they suffice to meet the fiscal demands of the state. Of course, if you look at the history carefully, this was clearly not the case. And the dynasty was consistently unable to meet its spending needs, whether militarily or economically or otherwise, just on the basis of raising non-agricultural taxes. Now, of course, this should not be surprising whatsoever, given that for throughout the entire Qing, some 70 to 80% of the economy was agricultural, right? So if you're not raising taxes on 70 to 80% of your economy, it doesn't really matter too much. It matters, but you're never going to be able to basically get enough taxes just by raising taxes on the remaining 20 to 25%. So there was demand side pressure to raise agricultural taxes. They were just consistently resisted. Now, what explains all this? That's the central question of this entire talk. And so any good explanation, as we saw in the setup, has to perform at least three basic functions, right? First, it has to explain the refusal to raise agricultural taxes. Second, it has to explain the differential treatment of agricultural versus non-agricultural taxes. So why do you treat agriculture versus commerce differently? Third, it has to manage to explain the difference, at least between the Qing and previous Chinese dynasties, because the Qing was, again, a major outlier. So let me just give at this point a very short history of Qing agricultural taxation. So it starts off after the Manchu conquest with some turbulence, as is always the case in early dynastic situations in China. It coalesces around late Ming tax levels eventually at some point around 1680. And from then, the absolute volume of agricultural taxes remains basically locked in place until 1900. There was one moderate expansion of around 10 to 15% around 1725, but that was almost kind of like the exception that proved the rule, because that one relatively moderate attempt to expand the agricultural tax base triggered a political backlash so large after 1735 that it just served to further entrench this generally conservative outlook of the Qing Fiscal State. And that's basically just like the backlash to that attempt further just completely entrenched the political refusal to raise taxes. In the meantime, as we talked about, the economy triples, the population triples, per capita consumption, per capita income, by most estimates, perhaps like slightly declines in a very moderate way, but for the most part stays stable. You had pretty much the same living standards in, let's just say, 1840 as you did perhaps around 1725, and yet the total volume of the economy, the possible tax base that state could tap into, basically either doubles or triples depending on your estimate. The agricultural taxes remain stagnant, and they continue to do so after 1850, when the state was plunged into non-stop fiscal crisis. The Taiping After that was the Yang movement, where the state was trying to basically spend lots of money on industrialization programs. After that, it was the Sino-Japanese War. The defeat in that war was catastrophic and created another round of fiscal crises after 1911. No, I'm sorry, after 1901, and that, like, from 1850 to 1911, these final 61 years of the dynasty, the state is pretty much in a perpetual state of either full-blown fiscal crisis or semi-fiscal crisis. And during this point, even while commercial taxes by 1911 were like more than 10 times higher than what they were in 1950. Even in 1901, they were already like 4 to 5 times higher than what they were in 1850. But agricultural taxes nonetheless continued to stagnate up until 1901. So there are, of course, as you can imagine, this is perhaps like one of the, I would personally argue, this is arguably the single most important kind of like institutional narrative for the entire Qing dynasty. So of course it has drawn some academic attention, and there are 3 major kinds of explanations. Right. So first is the Qing state didn't need to raise taxes. Second is it didn't have the capacity to do so, or third, they lacked the ideological will to do so. In their current forms, all of these are somewhat incomplete. Given the amount of time that we have, I'm going to try to basically just be really fast in talking about these. And if we have questions on how exactly these explanations work, we can talk about them more in the Q&A. Right. So the first category is the most popular. Right. There's a large literature that says, because the Chinese state fought fewer wars, it was under less fiscal pressure than its European peers, or perhaps even Japanese peers. And so therefore, it naturally taxed less than these countries that fought more wars. Now, of course, this has many problems. First of all, the Qing was actually a relatively warlike dynasty. It fought a lot of wars, expansionist wars. Between 1780, before 1780, after 1840, it fights wars all the time. And also, especially this can't explain the Sino-Japanese comparison, because for most of the Tokugawa reign, Japan was a pretty peaceful society. The second category, the Qing lacked the administrative capacity to raise taxes. This is proven wrong by what happens after 1901. Right? So after 1901, because the Qing state is so desperate for fiscal income, it finally clenches its teeth and decides to raise agricultural taxes for the first time in 2 centuries. At this point, right, the Qing state's administrative capacity was arguably at its weakest point at any point since like 1680. And so, despite being at its administrative nadir for over this like 2 century period, it actually manages to raise agricultural taxes quite successfully. There were no major revolts. There was some moderate acts of tax resistance in the localities. They were dealt with very easily. As a general matter, it didn't really destabilize. The dynasty's collapse after 1911 had virtually nothing to do with the agricultural tax hike. So the logic has to go, if you can raise taxes successfully after 1901, and of course after 1911, all these successor states, the Qing, keep agricultural taxes at this heightened level successfully for the next several decades, and they even raise them further. So if you can raise taxes pretty successfully after 1901, even though your administrative capacity is unusually weak by your own standards, it stands to reason that you probably could have done so at any point before 1901, and perhaps you likely would have been even more successful in engineering and pushing through this tax hike. So the capacity point is likely wrong as well. Of course, wrapped into the capacity point is kind of like a third possibility. Perhaps Qing political elites just didn't want to pay taxes themselves, and so they kept taxes low. Well, if that's the case, right, then it becomes extremely puzzling why political elites agreed to raise commercial taxes, but not agricultural taxes, because for the most part, compared with the average peasant on the ground, your average Qing elite, either political elite or economic elite, they're much more tapped into commerce in many ways than they are into agriculture. So they would have stood to lose much more, and many of them did, from the commercial taxes, and there was a lot of elite unhappiness over the commercial taxes, but the state still got it through. In comparison, agricultural taxes, which was perhaps like a lesser self-interested issue for the elites, that was the holy grail, and that was the sacred cow that never got touched whatsoever. So to wrap this up, the Qing state almost certainly had huge incentives to raise agricultural taxes. It also certainly had the ability to do so. So what's left, right? So there's a traditional school of thought that basically tries to argue that, okay, if these like rationalist explanations don't completely work, let's talk about ideology and culture, especially Confucian culture. And the idea here is that there's a Confucian moral bias against taxing farmers and peasants. There's a famous phrase in the 论语 about,子罕言厉, right? So Confucius does not speak of profit because it's unbefitting of a gentleman. And so the idea is that this moral kind of like not quite assault, but this like moral sneering at taxation and at accumulation of wealth was responsible, created a kind of like a general political attitude, in which it was not very easy to raise agricultural taxes, especially. Now, again, like this seems to make some sense, but then you have to consider again, like this kind of mentality, if it were doing work in Chinese politics, it must have been doing work for the entirety of Chinese history, because Chinese history has always been somewhat Confucian, and Chinese politics has always been, since the Han Dynasty, heavily Confucian in ideological orientation. So, for whatever reason, the Confucian bias never stopped previous Chinese dynasties from raising taxes, but somehow it did so in the Qing. That seems weird, doesn't it? Right. So, like, what changed in the Qing? Like, that somehow this Confucian ideology suddenly get weaponized in the Qing in ways that it didn't in previous dynasties. Well, if that's the case, then the story is not so much about the bias itself; it's about how the bias got politically activated, right? So it's simply like this kind of explanation simply begs the question of what changed in the Qing. Now, one possible theory is maybe this is all because of Manchu rule, right? Like the Qing is a conquest dynasty in the same way that the Yuan was. When you're a conquest dynasty, you're a little bit more nervous about how the population is going to respond to taxation because they're less happy with you. You have a little bit less inherent political legitimacy. Now, the interesting thing here is that this doesn't seem to explain the overall trend of taxation across the Qing, right? Because like Han resistance to Manchu rule progressively weakens over the course of the dynasty. But at the same time, if you track the political commitment to fiscal conservatism, that increases in intensity over the course of the dynasty all the time, especially vis-a-vis agricultural taxation, right? So at the same time that Han resistance to Manchu conquest rule is weakening, your commitment to not raising taxes is actually strengthening. This seems logically consistent with the Manchu-ness of the Qing dynasty being a major factor in entrenching this ideological orientation against raising taxes. So this is the point. Where I'm going to spend the final 10 to 15 minutes just talking about my own theory. We're not going to be able to go into any detail about this, but so the claim that I want to give, and this is the claim that will hopefully explain why the Qing was different from all these other previous dynasties, was you have to consider, like for any ideology, for any kind of like ideological idea to become really politically powerful, it has to have two different dimensions. There has to be, yes, there always has to be kind of like a normative message. You can't do X or you must do A. But at the same time, for that message to really have political force, you got to be able to predict what's going to go wrong if you don't follow the message, right? So this is where the pragmatic empirical dimension of ideology comes in. And this is the far less talked about dimension of an ideology. If you guys think about like the conventional ideologies that you see in the world today, they like every single major highly influential ideology has both of these components. So to give you one example, let's just talk about liberalism, right? Like liberalism has a set of normative ideas, freedom, rights, democracy, so on and so forth. It has also just as powerfully a set of empirical, pragmatic predictions on what's going to go wrong if you don't obey these normative ideals. Right? It predicts economic inefficiency, perhaps collapse. It predicts, political instability and public uprising. Like that empirical dimension of liberalism is as important to the political success of liberalism because it spooks, it kind of it scares people into not wanting to risk the outcomes of being illiberal. Just as much as the normative extortions of like let's all be free, be democratic, whatever. The same is true of communism, right? There's a normative ideal of communism. Then there's the pragmatic stuff, which is the part about Marxism that you get taught in Chinese history classes, which is like the movement from capitalism to communism is unstoppable. It's inevitable. It's a natural course of history. Resist any kind of resistance is futile. Don't try it. So the claim here is that like political actors may respond to normative extortions just in and of themselves, but they're not going to do so very consistently. The response becomes much stronger when both of these dimensions work together. So the claim that I want to make is this Chinese normative ideal against taxing peasants was not terribly, like for the most part, it was normative prior to the Qing. It had a normative message, but it didn't really have a terribly strong empirical dimension. But after the Ming-Qing transition, due to the nature of Ming collapse, this normative messaging gains a very powerful, very deeply entrenched empirical side. All of a sudden, the message goes from being largely normative, in many cases purely normative, and largely deontological. It goes from that to being pragmatic and empirical. Right. So, and the major catalyst for this change was Ming collapse. Now, the thing that you want to keep in your head as we move forward about Ming collapse is, yes, Chinese dynasties collapse for all kinds of reasons, and many of them are preceded by peasant rebellions and so on and so forth. There was only one major Chinese dynasty that was actually directly killed off by a peasant rebellion, right? And that was the Ming. The peasant rebellions at the end of the Han, the Tang, even the kind of like anti-Mongol rebellions at the end of the Yuan, that was not packaged as a peasant rebellion, but that was kind of like this general, like it was pitched as an anti-Yuan, anti-Mongol kind of like ethno-nationalist rebellion. Whereas the pure peasant rebellions at the end of the Han and the Tang actually didn't kill off the dynasty. They just weakened it and made it more viable for warlords who put down the peasant rebellion to also then stage coups against the dynasty. The Ming is the only example of a major Chinese dynasty being directly killed off by a peasant rebellion. These are China Saxe Beijing forces Chongzhen to commit suicide. For that psychological shock to the Chinese elite cannot be overstated, because again, like this is something that at that point had never actually happened before, and it was seen as a much larger and more serious failure of the Ming system, at least vis-a-vis its treatment of peasants, than the way the Tang or Han collapsed, right? And so to observe this transition, you can just look at these are rough caricatures of like pretty detailed kind of like historical survey of political arguments done in the Ming court against raising taxes and done in the Qing court against raising taxes, right? So during the late Ming, your standard anti-tax argument goes like this: raising taxes against peasants is normatively bad. the classics say as much. It might incite rebellion, but frankly, because the last time there was a serious peasant rebellion was all the way back at the end of the Tang, so we don't really have like a historically proximate example of a peasant rebellion in response to tax hikes. So we don't quite, and plus, the Tang peasant rebellions weren't exactly in response to tax hikes. So we think these tax hikes might incite rebellion, but we don't really know how serious the rebellion is going to be. We don't know if the rebellion is going to kill us. So in the end, like the gist of our argument, the weight of it really lies on the normative messaging, not the prediction of what might happen if you raise taxes. Nonetheless, the normative considerations are strong enough that you shouldn't do it. Now, if you compare this with how early Qing elites write about the same subject, the tone completely changes. So the early Qing memorials about taxes usually go like this, right? We all knew beforehand that it was normatively bad to tax peasants. We suspected that things could go wrong. Well, now we have proof, right? Like now we know, based on the Ming experience, that once you raise taxes beyond a certain threshold, you're going to have massive peasant rebellions that can destroy the entire dynasty. If we want to avoid the same fate, if we don't want to be killed by peasant rebellions, we can't raise taxes beyond that level. So as you can easily imagine, doing X will kill us is a much stronger political message than simply doing X is morally wrong. Of course, you want both of these things. You want to say something is morally wrong and it's going to kill us if you want to have maximum effect. But having the doing X, like being able to say with confidence and with proximate, psychologically salient evidence that doing X will kill us is quite essential in the end to making an ideological message politically powerful. And so, of course, Qing political discourse was of the doing X will kill us type, whereas pre-Qing discourse was largely only, doing X is morally wrong. So in the end, it's not that surprising that pre-Qing dynasties think, okay, it's morally wrong, but there are also moral arguments to tax if we can spend the money on good things. So what, it's kind of like makes us feel a little bit dirty, but whatever. But once the message turns into doing X will kill us, then of course everyone's like, okay, we can't do this because we don't want to risk the outcomes. Now, of course, we don't really have time to go this. Like the interpretation of the Ming dying to the Ming collapsing the peasant rebellions that were caused by tax hikes, that's a very iffy interpretation. Most historians who study the era will tell you there is massive historical controversy amongst modern historians of whether that was actually the case, which means in some ways like the fact that the early Qing elite almost just instantaneously coalesced around the belief that the Ming collapsed because of high taxes. That's something that is not necessarily kind of like that itself is not an ideologically neutral position, because ideologically neutral observers would not have coalesced around that position nearly as aggressively. Instead, there would have been massive debate because frankly, the facts don't always support this. So of course, that begs the question of why did they actually believe this in the early Qing? And that has to do in some ways with the ideological bias of Confucian elites. Right? Like when you think that taxing peasants is morally dubious and something could go wrong, and then something happens that would seem, at least at first glance, to seem to support that. Right, there are a bunch of tax hikes from 1580 to 1608, and then to 1620 and the Ming, and right after that they're followed chronologically by peasant rebellions. Now, most of us know better than to just say the peasant rebellions were caused by the tax hikes. You guys can read this. I'm not really going to talk about it too much because of time constraints. We like most of us know that there is no necessary causal connection between those two things, and it's a very complicated debate. However, if you have a cognitive bias, if you have a ideological bias that tells you taxation that taxing peasants is morally dubious, and you're already anxious when you raise taxes, then when something goes wrong, your immediate instinct, based on a huge amount of cognitive theory, will naturally be to blame the tax hikes for the peasant rebellions. So in some ways, like the idea, this pragmatic component of, like raising taxes will kill us, that was created under the kind of like cognitive veil and bias that was created by the normative component of the ideology itself in the first place. So there's a certain kind of like cognitive reinforcement, ideological bias story here to tell about the formation of the pragmatic idea. But nonetheless, the pragmatic idea could not have been formed without this like major catastrophic event of the Ming collapse, right? So you have to have both of these things, the a priori normative bias and the actual interpretable event. The combination of these two things produces the pragmatic empirical doing X will kill us narrative. Now, once you have the narrative, the Qing swings dramatically in the direction of being fiscally conservative and not raising agricultural taxes beyond the Ming levels. But that begs the question, okay, so this perhaps explains why in the early Qing there was this deep commitment towards fiscal conservatism. Now, how does that explain the longevity of this idea, right? Like after all, Qing fiscal conservatism has like a 220-year history. Surely an idea that comes into existence in like the 1750s, in the 1650s, can't have just on its own weight that much force by like 1840. Now, this is the part of the story that gets very interesting, right? So the Qing is not the only Chinese dynasty, is not merely the only Chinese dynasty that refuses to raise agricultural taxes. It's also the only major Chinese dynasty that never conducts a land survey. In fact, it legally bans land surveying after 1740. Now, why did they ban land surveying? Because interestingly, the assumption was that, frankly, if you do a land survey, the peasants will know right off the bat that the only reason why the government was going to do a land survey is because it wants to raise taxes. That's frankly the only reason why the government would sink money into doing a land survey. So essentially, a land survey sends a signal that we're trying to raise taxes down the road. So if you're so deathly fearful of the political consequences of raising taxes, then by the same logic, you want to avoid sending the signal that you're going to raise taxes by conducting a land survey. So the Qing never conducts a land survey, which means that for most of its fiscal history, it's actually flying blind in terms of its empirical understanding of how large the economy is. Right, so the economy, the agricultural economy actually triples in size from 1680 to the end of the dynasty. But for the most part, and shockingly so, the official government figures stay at pretty much their 1700 levels for the entire dynasty. So, like according to official records, there's actually no growth. Now, elites know this is inaccurate, but they still don't want to risk a land survey. But the thing is that if you want to overturn this dominant idea that we can't raise taxes, well, you better be able to say that, like, given what's going on in the overall economy, we can raise taxes and not have a problem, right? You want to be able to point to concrete evidence, politically usable evidence, that you can raise taxes and not trigger peasant rebellion. Now, that evidence in this kind of pre-modern setting can really only come in the form of governmentally sanctioned information about the overall size of the economy. And again, the only source of that kind of information was the land surveys, which every other major dynasty had conducted prior to the Qing with some regularity. So without land surveying, it becomes politically impossible to overturn the assumption that if you raise taxes, peasants will kill us. People know that official figures are inaccurate, but the thing is, the burden of proof is always going to be on the people who propose a change, right? And they can't point to any concrete politically authoritative evidence that the economy has grown enough that we can't raise taxes, that we actually can't raise taxes. So just to wrap it up very quickly, how did all this end? Well, at some point this becomes untenable because like the tax levels just are too low to meet spending needs. After 1900, astronomical war indemnities against the Japanese and against Western powers during the Boxer Rebellion forced the Qing state into pure desperation. They raised agricultural taxes during this period very tentatively and very nervously for the first time. They're still kind of flying blind, but they have to do it at this moment because otherwise they're just facing immediate collapse. Elites expect disaster from the agricultural tax hikes. Turns out none came. Now, once this happens, right, it breaks the spell because people realize, oh, like my God, like we've raised taxes for the first time in 2 centuries. We were expecting like some kind of massive peasant rebellion. Nothing happened. Maybe we can do it again. So this emboldens successor regimes to the Qing, even though they frankly were even administratively weaker than the Qing for quite some time, to raise taxes even further. And so between, let's just say 1911 and 1937, agricultural taxes triple in volume. And frankly, the peasantry, because the taxes start off at such a low base, even after they triple, it's still bearable. And of course, in the early PRC, the communist government is a very high tax regime relative to the Qing. It triples the taxes further from the Republican base. And so by the 1950s, the amount of tax, the volume and rate of taxation paid by the rural economy is about 10 times as high or even higher than what it was in 1900. So once the myth is shattered, there's no putting it back together. And instead, the Chinese state swings decisively towards this relatively high tax, high state capacity model that frankly we continue to see in operation even today. This account that I've just told you has a number of benefits. It explains why post-1840, even in the face of these massive demand hikes, there was still, for 60 years, an insistence to not raise the agricultural taxes. It explains the vertical uniqueness of the Qing vis-a-vis the Ming and the Song and the Tang. It helps with horizontal uniqueness, at least vis-a-vis Japan. And it also explains very, very crucially why agricultural taxes were treated differently from non-agricultural taxes, because in the origin story, right, the Ming collapses because of peasant rebellions. It doesn't collapse because of like merchant rebellions. So no one, like the assumption that raising taxes will kill us extends only to the peasantry and not to the commercial community. So everyone thinks, okay, we can raise non-agricultural taxes and still be safe. But the minute that we touch agricultural taxes, well, then we're tempting fate. And there's a large likelihood that we could be swamped by a massive peasant rebellion in short order. So this explains why agricultural taxes are treated differently from non-agricultural taxes. And then there's a conclusion, which I'm just going to skip. There's some general theorizing about how ideologies function. I'm just going to kind of like leave this up there for the Q&A. But other than that, that's the basic narrative that I want to tell you guys. And there are many things that we can talk about in terms of how this worked in its more technical details, and also about the general implications of this idea of how ideologies function. But I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can have a conversation now.
All right. Thank you so much for a very thorough and fascinating discussion. So we'll move now into a Q&A session. And again, please feel free, everybody, to ask questions in either Chinese or English. You can either raise your hand and I will be able to call on you so that you can interact directly with Professor Zhang, or you can leave some questions in the chat box as well. And I'll, in the interest of time, I may not be able to get to everything, but I can certainly try to filter through some of those questions. So anybody that has questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to actually preemptively ask a question because I know, as I don't want to call myself a historian, but with an undergrad history degree, I will say that the first question that pops up to my mind is a question about sources. And sort of, you've obviously had a very wide-ranging discussion here, but if you could just talk a little bit about what sources you used in your research.
Yeah,
I think
so because I'm focused on the kind of like the domestic aspect of the Qing, like how it treated its core Han population. I see in the chat box people are asking about Manchu sources. I have RAs who read Manchu who have read a few of them for me. It turns out that like when you're talking about how to tax the Han population, the vast majority of your sources are in Chinese, not in Manchu. The Manchu sources are mainly are useful for, like Manchu was used as the primary language for imperial conquest and for managing, say, Xinjiang, Tibet, or Manchuria. If you're talking about taxing like Zhongyuan or Jiangnan, the dominant language is going to be Chinese, and the main people who are discussing the policies are actually going to be the Han Chinese advisors to the Qing court. So the dominant set of materials that I use are like this vast collection that I had to pull from the archives and some other sources of basically political writings and political debates at the Qing court. So most of my sources are memorials. And then I have, I think by last count, something like 2,000 of these, stretching across the entire dynasty. Not all of them are useful, and we pick the ones that, like, we find and pick the ones that actually are. And apart from that, like, we supplement that by a pretty large amount of these, political writings, essays, and so on and so forth. So this is a relatively standard Qing elite political and ideological history, which means the sources that I use are not so different from the sources that everyone uses to discuss this kind of thing. It's a combination of memorials, essays, private books, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Great. All right. So we've already got quite a few questions from people, so I'll just go down the line here. Gavin, and again, everybody, in the interest of time, please try to keep your questions to be actually questions and to keep it relatively concise.
All right, thank you, Devin. Thank you so much, Professor Zhang, for this wonderful, very intriguing presentation. I just have one clarification and one question. So for clarification, when you're talking about the Song dynasty as the dynasty that has the strongest state capacity, do you mean the entire Song period, or you mean the Bei Song or Nan Song period? Is there like a difference?
Yes, so surprisingly, even the Nan Song has stronger fiscal capacity than any other Chinese dynasty. And frankly, the Southern Song actually has higher fiscal capacity on a kind of like a racial basis than the Northern Song, mainly because it was under stronger military pressure. So, yeah.
Okay, I mean, it's really interesting that that you challenge this kind of notion that wars built strong state, and then you talk about how Song that's kind of relatively weak, throughout the military base, but it's actually a strong state physically wise. And my question, I think, is
the thing about the Song is that the Song has a larger military on a per capita basis than any of the other Chinese dynasties. It has to, right? The military was really poorly run and inefficiently organized, so it loses lots of wars. But that doesn't mean the Song didn't spend on on military capacity. It does. Right?
Okay.
It was just really bad at using that military.
Okay, interesting. Well, my question is about how the cognitive bias is so strong to the point that for Qing dynasty that conquer the Zhongyan area and have all these for me kind of draconian policy liu fa bu liu tou and all these conquests and ping ding san fan, all these capacities, they have a strong coercive apparatus, but then they how can the cognitive bias be so strong to the point that they were no, we can't do that. Even though, I mean, if they think about the late Ming period, they have much more from my point of view, more coercive apparatus to do so. They can just simply raise taxes.
Oh, so I think you're right. The Qing, the early Qing, even the early Qing, likely actually has more control over a lot of regions than the late Ming did, and so perhaps there was more capacity. But the thing is, you have to think about what these Chinese literati had just been through, right? They had just observed this 300-year-old dynasty collapse to a peasant rebellion. The capital is sacked. There's a massive butchering of the Beijing political elite by these Zhejiang's armies. That's followed by catastrophic invasion from the Manchus. The emperor hangs himself. None of this had ever happened previously, right? So the perception was we failed more dramatically in this instance. We, in terms of the governing class, the literati, this is the most serious example of our domestic failure, perhaps in Chinese history. Across the thousands of years of Chinese history, we have never quite failed like this, and. So of course, as scholars have shown, the Ming-Qing transition was enormously traumatic for pretty much even the guys who switched over to the Qing and offered their allegiance to the new Manchu court, even for them, this was a massively traumatic experience. The psychological shame, the humiliation, the extreme anxiety, right? So they've just been through like a concentrated 10 to 15 year period in which their entire world is blown to smithereens. When you come out of that period, what you immediately want to do is you want to find a usable political message to show that you've learned from this experience. Right? Like every single crisis, and you see this in modern politics every single time, every single crisis is followed immediately by like massive elite mobilization to get a usable message out of the crisis. COVID has done this, the financial crisis in 2008 did this. Elites try to coalesce around one centralized message really quickly. And of course, the psychological incentive to do so after the Ming collapse was much, much stronger because of the nature of the trauma than any modern trauma, like any modern crisis that we've encountered in our lifetimes. So you have to put yourself into their shoes. Now, of course, from the Qing court perspective, it wants to pacify the populations. When you have like nearly every single Han Chinese advisor to you, who presumably these guys know the country much better than you do, just like lying down on the tracks and saying that like, my God, if you raise taxes beyond this level, you're going to just repeat the mistakes of the Ming, and you're going to suffer the same fate. You as a new conquest dynasty, hoping to appease the local population somewhat, you have a pretty strong incentive to listen to them. Right, so that explains this this massive shift towards fiscal conservatism in the early dynasty. Now, of course, the entrenchment and continuation of that swing has a different logic to it, and then there we go more into the realm of like, if you don't do land surveys, the politics are such that you can't even credibly propose raising taxes. That's a bit of a different rationale than the original ideological swing in the early Qing. But for the ideological swing, you have to put yourselves into their shoes and try to see the world from their point of view. And that point of view is an incredibly traumatic one.
All right, thank you so much, Professor.
Great, let's move on here. Wang Danqi.
Thank you, Devin, and thank you, Professor Zhang, for this amazing presentation. So I'm Albert. I'm from University of Pennsylvania, studying mathematical economics and political science, and looking for further studying law school and public policy school. So I'm quite interested in what you have discussed about in this amazing presentation. So one of the quick questions that I want to ask is that when we're talking about the agricultural taxation for the Qing dynasty, I was wondering how much, what's the portion of the agricultural tax serves as a fiscal revenue income, fiscal revenue source for the Qing dynasty, and therefore the real question is how important it is to finance the fiscal foundations of the empire through the agriculture tax.
Yeah, so for most of the Qing, right, your overall economy is 70% agricultural. This actually goes up in the late Qing to about 80%. But for most of the Qing, it's 70%, which corresponds to roughly something between 70 to 80% of governmental revenue came from agriculture. After 1850, right, commercial taxes just dramatically shoot up, whereas agricultural taxes continue to stagnate. So by 1900, commercial taxes overtake agricultural taxes as the primary source of income. But the problem is, this is not an economy in which commerce is economically dominant, right? Like agriculture is still economically dominant. So when more than half of your income comes from 20% of your economy, you can easily imagine why that's kind of like an economic problem, because you're sharply undertaxing parts of your economy and you're arguably overtaxing the more kind of economically modernized, productive parts of your economy. So one of the interesting things is that after they raise taxes on commerce, which mainly is borne by industrial product, like manufacturing, so on and so forth, the goal of the late Qing dynasty is constantly to try to industrialize, right? But partly because of their fiscal policy, the share of the economy that is agricultural actually goes up during this period. And in some ways, that's just kind of like a rational response to governmental fiscal policy, right? If you invest in manufacturing or commerce, you're going to pay very high taxes. If you invest in agriculture, you're going to pay nearly non-existent taxes at the same time. So a lot of elite money actually pours into buying land and investing in agriculture during this period in which the government actually would have wanted that money to go into industry. So from the late Qing court's perspective, a lot of this commercial tax hiking was kind of counterproductive and destructive for their own purposes. But at the same time, they're still under such a tight ideological straitjacket, raising agricultural taxes is just out of the question. So you can see like why given the scale and the shape of the economy, this kind of like late Qing commercially oriented fiscal transition was not exactly that sustainable.
So a follow-up question is that a somehow similar logic to the Reagan economics. That is, if you reduce the taxes and incentivize the increase of the tax base, let's say the agricultural production, you actually have more more tax income than you have been before. But it seems that from your perspective, like even though like the agriculture like tax income might increase over time, but on the other hand, it stifles the increase of the manufacture and the industrial sector, which overall hampers the productivity and the capacity of the Qing dynasty.
Yeah. So exactly. Right. So like like you look at the Japanese experience, right? So what does a less ideologically hampered state do when it wants to stimulate industry? Well, what the Japanese said was they taxed the hell out of agriculture after the Meiji transition. After the major restoration, and they use that money to fund national banks and investment in industry. Like what you actually want to be doing is extract resources from your non-industrial sectors and pour the money into industry. Now, what the Chinese government was doing more or less was actually the opposite, and I think it knew the problems of doing that. But like in its own mind, it thought that it had no choice.
Yeah, just a final question, and yes, my apologies for taking so much time. And just a final question, which is a more broad question.
So if you have more questions, I think we should move on. But if you have more questions, just email me, okay?
All right, sure. So from the shift from Ming Dynasty to Qing Dynasty,
we should move on at this point.
Okay, sure.
But go ahead and you can email directly.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to Rain.
So basically, you mentioned that Qing did not just leave the military and just there, but spent some of the taxes collected towards the military construction, but it was just still really bad. However, that Qing spending money towards the military would mean that it didn't see it as insignificant. So why did it collapse so badly?
No, so could you clarify the question? Right? So what I said about the military being inefficient was about the Song, not the Qing, right? The Qing actually had a very efficient military.
Yeah, but why did it still fail to defend itself against the attacks that happened later on?
Oh, you mean this? Why was the Qing military unable to ward off Western gunships and things like that? Well, there's the military gap between industrial and non-industrial states really can't be covered just by efficient organization. So at some point, the fact that you're a pre-industrial power and the Brits, the English and the French and the Germans are industrialized, and even the Japanese are on their path to are pretty heavily industrialized. By the 1890s, that becomes impossible to overcome if you don't have your own industrial capacities, right? So in many ways, that doesn't really have, those defeats don't have that much to do with either fiscal capacity or military capacity in the traditional sense, unless you want to believe, as I do, but this is kind of like a roundabout belief, that the weak fiscal capacity of the Qing state had detrimental effects on its capacity to industrialize and build kind of like a military industrial complex in the late Qing. Right? So perhaps the best comparison is between like the Qing and the Japanese. They start off around 1860. Both embark on this path towards trying to rapidly industrialize and to rapidly build up a modern military. The Japanese state has a far higher level, even in absolute terms, of fiscal capacity than the Qing state does. And so it spends much of that money trying to basically build up an industrial framework to beef up its military. Once it does that, by the 1890s, its industrial production capacities have completely outstripped what you see in the Qing, and like the tactics, the outcome of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895 are pretty much a consequence of that. So you can draw a connection between weak fiscal capacity in the Qing and weak military capacity, but it's not quite so direct as it was when you're purely just comparing pre-modern militaries.
I remember at the beginning of the Qing dynasty, they had one of the most advanced military embarkments. So is it due to like how their cities were arranged and how their communities worked that it gradually faltered?
No, I mean, like even I would say like in terms of domestic military mobilization, even by the Taiping, like even by 1850, when the Qing is not fighting a modernized, industrialized opponent, it still mobilizes pretty fast and in some ways pretty efficiently, right? So there was decay and corruption in its military through the centuries, but like you look at the mobilization against the Taiping, it was pretty fast, pretty efficient, and by like pre-modern standards, it was quite effective. The Qing's major defeats, its major military failures, all come in the face of industrialized foreign powers banging down on its doors. And for that, I mean, no amount of efficient organization is going to save you when you're trying to fight a gunpowder-oriented, industrialized opponent with pre-modern weapons. Right, so like for me, industrialization is like the sine qua non of being able to fight with any kind of parity against industrialized opponents. Like if you don't have that, regardless of decay or not, in institutional terms, you're going to lose.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Devin, and thank you, Professor, for your amazing speech. I'm Eric, an incoming freshman at Yale and US College, and my question is, how did the fact that the ruling Manchu were ethnically different from the majority of the nation play into this topic we've been talking about? Is there perhaps an ethnic narrative here?
Right. So exactly. Like as I talked about during the course of the presentation, like this is one possible theory that you could use. It's not exactly a terribly persuasive one for the following reasons. One is that if you just look at the sources, they don't mention the Manchu-ness of the dynasty as a reason to not raise taxes very often. In fact, like after like 1670, effectively not at all. If it were a continuing rationale, you would have expected this concern over ethnic tensions to at least be mentioned. It was not taboo to mention this in the context of high-level political debates, right? But it never was mentioned. The second thing is, as I said, like the ethnic tensions receded over the course of the dynasty. So like the ethnic tensions are highest at the beginning of the dynasty, right after the conquest. Eventually, there's some syncretization of the Manchu ruling elite. They get merged into Han culture a little bit. The Han elites get used to Manchu rule. They get merged into these like ruling institutions a little bit. And so this kind of like this process of mutual adaptation by 1700s produces what you would likely consider to be like a pretty stable, durable regime. And it just like it keeps getting better from that point onwards, at least in terms of ethnic tensions. At the same time, the Qing still had like Qing fiscal stagnation does not really set in until after 1700, right? So right when your ethnic tensions are falling, your level of political commitment to fiscal stagnation and conservatism is actually like peaking, and increasing over time, right? So like if you compare that trajectory, like one's declining, one's going up, it seems kind of dubious to explain one with the other, right? So this is not to say that the managementness of the Qing court didn't have any effect in the early Qing, it like did. But the later entrenchment, the later kind of escalation and institutionalization of the fiscal stagnation, it's hard to say that had too much of a connection with the ethnic tensions caused by the Manchu conquest.
Great, and I think we can squeeze in maybe one or two more, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
All right, Nick.
好的，老师好，我是来自于深圳的一名中学生，然后请允许我用中文问这个问题，就是我最近了解到，在这个清朝晚期的时候，有一位学者，他对于这个清朝总体的政治体系，认为说这个清朝它主要是一个较为分裂的国家，因为他认为中国人呢，他其实呢很少的结合在一起，他一般是由伦理、由社会道德伦理所连接在一起，所以他认为清朝它其实从整体上来说，它只是由各个州府州县它所组成的伦理单位，然后而形成的这么一个政治。所以请问是不是正是因为这个问题而导致了清朝它在税收方面，然后并没有十分的有一个非常好的效果的推行以及实现，而且同时呢，这个清朝呢，它在晚清或清代中期的时候，由于那个西方文化的影响，然后导致了这个清朝它既无法完全或者系统化的学习西方的理论，比如说提出来的西方的民主理论或西方的他们的税收理论，也使中国自己原本的税收，然后整个系统，然后也濒临崩溃了，然后导致了清朝最终的腐败。
我觉得就这个问题要分几步讨论。第一个，先问是不是，对吧？就是清朝是不是就是州县，就中央对州县的凝聚力格外的弱一些？这个其实我觉得很难讲。某种程度上，清朝和明朝在这方面没什么本质区别。当然，就是在他到了清末的时候呢，当然就是说各州府开始闹地方自治之类的，这个确实有。但问题就是说，这个对于我说的这种就是财政上的困境来说，这是果而不是因，对吧？因为你进入了财政困境之后，中央政府的权威性和它的这种强权能力都比以前更低了，因此才出现了大规模的这种地方自治运动。就是因为就地方从中央拿不到钱，地方的财政需要自我安排、自我解决。那这种情况之下，他们当然就是说，就是某种程度上就随着财政的这种去中央化和地方化，就是各种各样的这种行政上的就是去中央化的趋势也变得更明显一些。然后随之而来的到了晚清是政治上的这种地方化。所以因此就是我觉得就是说你这个因果关系可能搞反了，就是说不是这些东西导致了清朝的财政弱势，财政弱势早在这些去中央化的趋势出现之前就已经存在很长时间了，而是说财政弱势导致了去中央化。至于说学习西方人财政制度怎么说呢？就是说，西方人财政制度主要是什么呀？他们最大的一个创新是说我们少依赖一些就少依赖农业税，更重的依赖商税。这个清朝学的挺好。 只不过是说在西方推行商税推行的最成功的地方呢，他们在推行商税的同时，起码就是农业税也是会增加的，因为就是你推行商税本身需要建立一套新的财政体制，而这个财政体制的建立是需要成本的，这个成本从哪儿来？你只能从旧有的税种中去拿钱。因此，就是每一个成功建立起商税就稳固且可持续的商税体制的国家，在建立这个体制过程中呢，都是需要依赖大规模的来自于农业税的新增投资。而清朝它最大的问题就是它在建立商税体制的时候呢，农业税是不动的，而且是肯定是说是严重不足的，因此导致的就是说清朝的商税体制建立的也比较半吊子。就是它虽然有了商税体制，然后也因此赚了很多钱，但它的运作、它的就是能力都远远没有达到一个就是制度上的最优解。因此呢，就是说归根到底就是你即使要就是说白就是你即使要学西方这种体制去建立商税体制，你也是要以农业税足够给力为基础前提，才能够建立起比较成功的商税体制。而清朝一个最大的问题就是，他在建立商税体制的时候，农业税基本是崩溃的。因此，就是确实他可能学的不是很好。但是话说回来，就学这些东西吧，你也不一定非要看西方。就中国历史上不是没有过比较成功的商税体制。就是宋朝的时候，他在北宋中期的，他已经开始就从农业税转向商税了。而就是北宋中后期以及南宋，国家的主要税种其实是商税。但是呢，就宋代的商税体制比清朝其实要成功很多，它更科学、更有效。原因是因为它建立的时候呢，国家整体基于农业的税收还比较强，因此它有足够多的钱去建立起一个足够稳固、足够理性的这种新的商税征收体制，而不像清朝这个后来所谓建立的这个离经体制呢，就是它比较分崩离析一些。行，我觉得就先回答到这了。
Sorry if people are not understanding both English and Chinese. It's a little hard to do. And then I think, Kelly, do you have a question?
Oh, yes. Hello, Professor Zhang, and thanks for the really inspiring talk. And actually, I want to follow the next question to ask a question about like the different regional economic situation in the Qing dynasty, where you talk about, for example, in the southern part of China, it's like, for example, the trade ports, and some of the exchanges between China and Southeast Asia or the labor trade that time, would that also help with the economic situation of Qing dynasty, or is it does not help that much? Yeah, I'm a bit curious about
right. So if you're asking about like a cross-regional trade with Southeast Asia or something like that, there was quite a bit of that, right? So that was one of the bases for which the Qing could still survive after 1850 for more than half a century. Are largely on the basis of trying to raise commercial taxation. A huge part of commercial taxation is tariffs. And because of the relatively large volume of foreign trade that the Qing had, both with maritime powers and also with this kind of like land-based border trade with Southeast Asia, the tariffs were quite significant in the late Qing. And that was perhaps the only relatively well-run part of the Qing fiscal system in the late 19th century. Now, again, the problem with that is that, well, yes, that stuff is important, but still, like you really shouldn't rely on foreign trade, which is at this point 10% of the economy, to be the main pillar of your entire fiscal income. Right? If you do that, then something's out of whack, and it's likely not going to be that sustainable. Right? So like the Qing has all kinds of regional variations, and commerce was robust across regions and so on and so forth. So to some extent, like that made this commercial tax heavy strategy of the late Qing viable for a time. But in the end, the fundamentals of the economy are such that again, like the share of agriculture in the economy is actually growing during this period from 70 to 80%. If you can't tax agriculture relatively effectively, nothing else that you do is going to matter much.
I see. Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Well, I think in the interest of time, we can stop there. Thank you, everybody, so much for a good round of questions and for staying on. Thank you, Professor Taisu Zhang, for a fantastic presentation and for being so generous in answering all those questions. As per Yale Center Beijing tradition, I'm actually going to unmute everybody so you guys can all thank Professor Zhang yourself. And for those of you guys that are able to, please turn on your webcams. We're going to do a group picture as best as we can here via webcam. So please.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks,
Thank
Professor.
you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Professor.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.